topic is your why framework. And when I say why, I mean WHY, and that's in quotation marks. So before we actually, well, let me tell you before we get into the points why I came up with this subject, because I was actually doing a sales training for some people who are career sales people. And I shared this framework as a result of a question that I asked. So I was explaining to them when it came to sales, period. I'm trying to remember what I was talking about. So I was talking to them about the power of using story in sales. That was the subject of what I was talking about in that particular moment. And I started explaining to them how I had a certain reason why I was doing certain things in business, at least when I first started, and actually still to this very day. And I started telling them that, here's what I was telling, that you need to have a reason why you're doing what you're doing, selling what you're selling, why you're putting certain things out there to the world, because human beings need to understand the connection between an action that a person is taking and the person themselves or the company itself. Why does it make sense for this person or this company to be doing this particular thing? And it doesn't mean your story has to be anything like mine, but there needs to be a story that explains why does it make sense for this person to be doing this thing. So when I explained that to them and I started using myself as an example, which I'm going to do here in today's episode, someone, excuse me, at the end of my training said to me, Dre, can you lay out the framework for how you explained that thing that you said? And what's interesting is I didn't explain it in the form of it being a framework. And as a matter of fact, I wasn't even thinking about it as a framework. And I had just given them the explanation. But I guess I've talked about these things so often that it sounds like a framework, even when I'm not trying to make it sound like one. And then as I broke it down and explained it to them, the people in the audience as I was talking, I realized that there actually was a formula behind this. And now I've codified it and I'm going to share it here in today's episode because I didn't even realize that I was using a formula. It was just something that I was used to explaining to people. So what we're going to explain here today is all about how you explain why you do the things that you do today, because people who will come into your audience or become your customers or come into your world in whatever way, they want to know the reason behind what you're doing. They don't want to just know what you're doing. So if I decided I want to go sell concrete, people want to know what's the reason why you sell concrete, especially if you're going to be the front facing individual who's there. So the reason, again, doesn't have to be similar to my reason. It doesn't have to be something you grew up doing. It could be that you just realized that there was a great business opportunity to serve people with high quality concrete, or maybe you had a house and the concrete foundation started crumbling and you realized that the concrete being sold out there was cheap and it was robbing people and deceiving them. So you decided to get in the business to get all the bad dealers out of the industry. Or you got into the concrete business because your uncle was in the business and your uncle was about to pass away and he wanted to pass the business on to you. And instead of selling it, you decided that you were going to get in the business and make it better because you saw an opportunity based on the things that you know and because you know a lot of people in real estate. Whatever the reason being, people just need a reason, and people want to know the reason behind what you're doing. It needs to make sense because, again, human beings, we need to make sense of, again, the mental connections. You're going to provide those connections for them by explaining to them the framework behind why you are who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. Now, this framework, I will tell you, usually works best with people who are in expert businesses. So these are people who are selling intellectual property in the forms of books, courses, coaching, consulting, professional speaking, and the person who is behind the material is usually the same person that everybody is seeing. So with a landscaping or concrete business, it may not be as smooth as a connection between the two. So really what I'm making this framework around is those of you who are in expert type of businesses, or if you're selling a product or service and you want to make a human connection with your customer or prospect, then this why framework works really well to help build that connection. All right, that's the topic here today. Point number one. Today's topic, once again, is your why, WHY framework. First step is I was doing X. That's your first point. All right, so the start of your framework is explaining to people what is the status quo situation that you had been in before the evolution of what you now do even started. So before you even got to where you are today, what were you doing originally that started this whole process? This is also, I could have said this in the introduction. What I'm going to explain here today is also a form of what some people call the hero's journey. Any of you who watches a lot of movies, like action movies, Disney movies, or you read a lot of books, specifically in the fiction space, then you'll see this hero's journey happening all the time. And also, if you follow people who are in my lane, like influencers, experts, well-known people, maybe even famous people whose business is based around their personal story and what they have personally experienced, and then the results of that, you're going to find this hero's journey in everybody's process. And they're all going to follow these steps that I'm telling you here today. So this first one is I was, and this was like the status quo, whatever the situation was. And the status quo, folks, does not necessarily have to be some negative thing. My status quo situation, for example, to start my story, was that I was playing professional sports and I was posting content to the internet showing athletes how to practice basketball. That was the status quo if I'm telling the story of how I got to what I do now today as an entrepreneur. The status quo would start with me playing professional sports. They don't need to know the background of playing 1 year of high school and walking on D3. Now, if I want to talk about, if I was talking to basketball players about my situation, then I would go further back in the story. So it depends on who you're talking to and what point in the story it ends to decide where you want to start. Because again, everybody's life story is long enough to fill a book. You don't need to tell people your whole life story when they ask you why you do what you do, but you need to tell them enough that they understand where you were. And this is the first step, where you were. And then we're going to get to the rest as we move on. So me, is I was playing professional sports, posting content on the internet, showing athletes how to practice. This is generally a good thing. Things were pretty much going well for me. I was having a good time doing it. And at the same time, I was starting to build an audience on the internet that will later become a big part of what I now do. Now, at the time when I was doing it, I didn't realize that posting content online, specifically at this time it was YouTube, I did not realize that that was going to become a big thing and a big opportunity for me. I was just doing it kind of as a, I guess you could call it a hobby at that point, because it wasn't really a lot of money to be made in doing so. And before 2009, I wasn't making any money by publishing content to the internet, even though I started publishing back in 2005. Okay, so this part is usually pretty basic. When you're explaining your why framework, you can just give people a sentence or two, usually it's really quick, just telling them what the situation was. So the situation could be, I was a single mom with 2 young kids. All right, that's your starting point. That's where you were, your status quo. I was a professional athlete posting content to YouTube and at the same time playing professional basketball. That's your status quo. I was an unemployed person looking for a job. That's an example of the status quo. Usually it's pretty basic, is very understandable. The story really starts at the next point when things actually start happening. But the story is generally not interesting until something happens that's kind of unexpected or unwanted, or we got to figure this out. All right, when you get to that point, that's when you really start to get a story. All right, the story is just, I was an unemployed person looking for a job. I got hired, got a job, and here I am still working at the job. That's not interesting. What's interesting is when something unexpected again, or some kind of curve gets thrown at the hero in the story. So let's move on to number 2 so we can get to that. Today's topic, once again, is your why framework. Number 2. Usually the second part of the framework is that you got presented with, as I just said, something unexpected, which presents itself in a form of some type of problem or challenge that you must resolve. All right, that's when the story begins, is when something unexpected happens. And again, if you watch action movies or Disney movies, for example, you'll notice that this often happens usually pretty early in the story. And it may not be the last time it happens. Sometimes there may be several unexpected things that happen in the story. But for the purpose of this framework, when I'm explaining here today, I'm only going to give you one, but you could have this happen over and over again. Again, your favorite action movie, they probably had a whole bunch of unexpected things happen that they had to keep figuring them out over the course of the movie, which is what makes it an action movie. It makes it a cliffhanger, as they say, because you're on the edge of your seat trying to figure out how they're going to solve this next problem that just happened. So this second point, when the problem or challenge gets presented, this is where things get thrown off a little bit or thrown off a lot. So your status quo situation has had its boat rocked, so to speak. You got a big wave and the boat's about to turn over and capsize. And based on the challenge that got thrown in front of you, now you got to figure something out that you can't figure out. So for example, a person could say that I was perfectly healthy and living a normal life, and then I went to the doctor and found out that I had cancer. All right, everything was going normal, and boom, now you got cancer. Now everything got thrown upside down. All right, so if any of you seen the TV show called The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, all right, Will Smith actually sings this in the rap. He says, "This is a story all about how my life got flipped, turned upside down." Right there, that's the story. See, he was doing something normal because what did he say? West Philadelphia, born and raised, on the playground is where I spent most of my days. And then, I'm not going to sing the whole rap, but then he said, a couple of guys who were up to no good started making trouble in my neighborhood. What is that? That is a flip of the script. He was living in West Philadelphia doing his normal thing on the playground. Then all of a sudden, some people wanted to start trouble. That's when the story got flipped. All right, everybody catching this? And again, think of your favorite movies and your favorite stories. You'll notice that this happens every single time. So you're perfectly healthy, you found out you had cancer, or you're working at a job doing well, then unexpectedly, out of nowhere, you get laid off or fired. Usually, if you get laid off or fired, they don't tell you like a month in advance, like, hey, next month you're getting fired. They just call you in the office on Thursday. You're perfectly good at the job on Wednesday. Thursday, they call you in the office and you're fired. And on Friday, you are unemployed and looking for a job. Usually, it happens just like that. So it just comes out of nowhere. In my case, here was my situation. I was playing pro ball. I was helping players online. And the players who I was helping online, and again, I'm leaving certain parts of the story out because it depends on who I'm talking to and what point I'm trying to get to. Players who I was helping online started asking questions about mindset. They started asking me questions about the mental side of basketball. They wanted more than just the here's how to dribble and here's how to shoot. All right, so that's how my situation got flipped relative to the conclusion that I want to come to. And again, based on my story, I can pick different pieces of the story to tell based on what conclusion I'm getting to, which is based on who's asking me the question. So I'm talking to some entrepreneurs and some salespeople. This is the way that I would tell the story. Now, if I'm talking to basketball players, I would tell the story differently, and I would pick different aspects of the story because it's more relevant to them based on who the audience is. Okay, so again, look at your own life. Again, there are certain parts that are relevant to your audience, certain parts that are irrelevant to your audience, and you need to pick the right parts to make the story sing, make it sound good. So the players who are watching me online ask for the mental pieces of the game. Now, this was a problem, and the reason why this is a problem is because I hadn't even thought about giving that part of the game out to players. I didn't even consider it necessary or valuable. And there were other things that happened again as well. But again, if I'm telling the short and quick version of the story, that's the only part that's relevant. That's the only part that I need to share. So depending on how much time you have, you can tell more or less of your story. You can give more or less detail. This is something that I've told all of you in the past. I will tell you again here today, that when it comes to telling your story, you need to be able to tell your story in different time frames. You should be able to tell your story in a 15-second, a 60-second, a 5-minute, a 15-minute, a 30-minute, and a 90-minute version. If you had to tell your story, you should be able to do it in each one of those bites and a bunch of bites in between. So someone said to me, let's say I appear on somebody's show and they say, welcome Dre Baldwin to the show. Dre, welcome, thanks for being on the show. Can you give us a 30-second snippet of who you are, where you come from, and what you're about? I would need to answer that question in 30 seconds. I would say something like, well, hey, Mike, thanks for having me here on your show. Yes, my name is Dre Baldwin. I'm a former professional athlete. I now run a business called Work on Your Game. What we do here is we take the tools to help athletes reach the top of the sports world, and we translate those tools over to the business and professional world to help people like those in your audience perform at their highest level, do so consistently, and to produce more results, period. Now, that's about 30-second version of my story. Now, I could, again, if I had 90 minutes to tell my story, I could take 90 minutes to tell my story, just giving a whole lot more detail in that process. And you need to be able to do the same and a bunch of intervals in between based on how much time you have. And again, how captive is your audience, or how much do they actually need to hear all the details? So you tell the short and quick version or the long version. And again, keep just leaving the parts that are relevant to the person who is listening. And the specific problem or challenge that led to where you are now, that's the one that you want to bring up. I would assume that most of you listening to this have dealt with many problems and challenges in life. You don't need to tell people all of them. All right, I've dealt with problems and challenges. One time my metabolism wasn't going too well, my digestion was messed up, and one time I got sick. One time I had a headache. Are any of those relevant to the story that I'm telling? No, so I'm not going to tell you that part. Get it? All right, move on to point number 3. Today's topic, once again, is your why framework. How do you put together your why framework, which explains why you do what you do? The third part is when you start trying solutions and you go through a bunch of trial and error to figure things out. So now you are clear on what the challenge is and what the problem is. This is the part of the story where you explain what you tried to do, or what, let's say tried, because we're going to assume you figured this out. What you tried to do to deal with the situation in front of you. Here's where often this second point that I just told you, where things got flipped, and this part right here is often when the audience can find some identification with you, because you can point out some things that you tried that they also tried. Or you could point out, hey, I was being healthy and all of a sudden I got cancer. Maybe it's somebody in the audience, they were healthy and they got cancer. Maybe if someone else out there, they were playing basketball and they got kicked off the team. Maybe somebody else out there, they had a good job and they got fired. So when you do that, you create a connection with a person, because they can say, okay, I can see myself in Dre's story, because the same thing that happened to Dre happened to me. And again, that's the same thing with you. So this is why you want to pick certain parts of your story based on your audience, because you can surmise that there's certain aspects of your story that people in your audience, depending on who they are, may be able to connect with. So when I'm talking to a bunch of salespeople, which I was when I came up with this concept, I assumed many of them probably couldn't connect with, I'm playing basketball and I ended up unemployed from playing basketball. They probably don't even know what that means, what it looks like, or what it feels like. But if I'm talking to an audience of pro basketball players, and I said that, most of them would know what that feels like. Even if they haven't personally experienced it, they've had a teammate or a friend who has experienced that exact same thing. So I could use it with them. I wouldn't use it with those other folks. Now, why did I use the fact that players started asking me about mindset when I'm talking to salespeople? Is because a lot of what I talk to salespeople about is related to mindset. So even though I was playing basketball and they may not relate to that at all, when I say people who are following me started asking me about mindset, they want to know how I explained it and how I broke it down. They get that part because that's exactly what I'm talking to. That's exactly what I'm talking about to them right now today. So again, when we get to this third part here, the trial and error, this is when you start explaining all the stuff you tried to do to solve the problem. Now, again, sometimes your trial and error, just by the term alone, sometimes means that the first trial usually produces an error, not a result. So you got to try a whole bunch of things, or not a solution, let's say. So it could be a result that's not the one you want. So sometimes you may have to try several things before you land on the thing that actually works. And again, if you follow action movies, entire movies are built around this very concept of all the different things that a person tries, but it doesn't work out. And the bulk of the movie is based around this. All right, I'm trying this, that didn't work, trying that didn't work. If you saw the movie The Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith, and I believe that was his actual son acting as his child in the movie, Will Smith was basically destitute, didn't have a whole lot of money, was looking for a job, couldn't find one, was bringing his son to a daycare where they had the word happiness spelled wrong outside on the wall. And Will was bringing his child to daycare, but then he didn't have the money to pay for the daycare. He's about to get kicked out of the daycare because he couldn't. His son was going to get kicked out because he couldn't afford to pay for it. Eventually, he ends up homeless. He's sleeping in subway cars, and he's trying all these different things to produce success, but he keeps running into walls, and things are simply not working. It happen over and over and over again, right? And that's the trial and error. And if you saw the movie The Pursuit of Happiness, the bulk of the movie is based around him wanting to create success, but unable to do so because he tried a whole bunch of stuff and none of it was working. And I'm not a big movie watcher, but you think of your favorite movie and you'll notice the same framework happening in every single one. So you may already know what the solution is. The problem is you didn't see anyone offering that solution, so you don't understand there's a need. Maybe there's something that you already have. This was my situation. I already knew that there was a solution to the question that these basketball players are asking me for. So my story again, basketball players watching me online and start asking me about mindset. That's when the things got flipped. I knew how to explain mindset to people. The problem was I didn't value explaining mindset to people because I didn't think anybody needed it. Because unlike dribbling a basketball, I can see when you are deficient. I cannot see if someone's deficient mentally because I cannot read your mind. I don't know how you're thinking. I can only go off of what you tell me. So I had the value of teaching mindset. The problem is I didn't see any value in it. So since I didn't see any value in offering the solution, I didn't think that there was a need. But when I saw people were asking, I said, okay, maybe there's a possibility here. So I assumed other people already thought the same way that I did. Because again, as I just said, you can't see another person's mind. And at that point, once I realized that people wanted this and maybe they didn't have it already, I started sharing the mindset piece. But at the same time, this was still a trial for me. I didn't know if this was going to be no perfect solution because I had no idea how people would respond to it. I didn't know if it would make much of a difference because I assumed, again, this was just common knowledge. So that ended up being the solution to my problem. Once I started putting it out, we saw what happened next. So let's move on to point number 4, which is part of this. Today's topic, once again, we're talking about your why framework. Point number 4 is that once you come up with a solution that you think works, you actually put it to use and you put it out into the real world. And as they say, real life alters the lab test. So once you start using and sharing your solution, here's where you take it a bit further and see if your solution can actually do what you think it's going to do, and you find out what the potential of that solution is. Sometimes the potential of that solution is not much. To give you an example, in 2020, I remember I was in a coaching program and it was encouraged that I pick a specific niche to focus on. I decided that I was going to take, and it needs to be a niche that I could dominate. And I picked a niche that I could take teaching pro basketball players how to, or pro level basketball players how to play professionally, called the Overseas Basketball Blueprint, which I still have that framework and that program to this day. If you're watching on video, there's the book right there, that blue book. If you want to play professional basketball overseas, you can go to balloverseas.com, get the book for free, just cover the shipping. So that was the area that I was going to focus. That was the solution that I came up with, or the, let's just say the solution that I came up with, because it may or may not have worked. Let's say, we'll just call it a solution for now, quote unquote solution. And I worked on it for a few months, and I came to a realization that this was not the right market to be in. The reason was not because there aren't players who want to play pro ball who aren't playing, but because there simply wasn't enough market opportunity there, meaning there wasn't enough money to be made in serving that audience. I could definitely serve that audience and serve them very well. The problem is there wasn't enough money to be made in that space. And being that I was and am focused on maximizing my revenue, that audience was not a good audience, because players who are trying to play pro ball, first of all, they don't have a lot of money to pull from because they're trying to play pro ball. And also, it's not like this is some 50-year-old person who's starting a business after a 30-year career where maybe they have saved up and built up a nest egg of money. This is a person who is in their early 20s for the most part, who hasn't really had much of a professional career yet. So where are they going to draw money from? They haven't really made a ton in any industry yet because they're new to the professional world. So this is not a good market to be in if the focus is making money. And since my focus wasn't is making money, this was not a good space. So that was a trial and error. It was an error for me based on what I wanted. For someone else, that may be a perfect situation. Maybe they're okay with doing it like that way. Excuse me. Maybe they can do it as a side thing to their other main things. But for me, it didn't make sense. Okay, so this is where, again, you got to put your solution out there and see what works. Now, again, I just told you several months I was working on that to see what the opportunity was. And I decided at some point, this ain't the right space. Okay. So you put your solution out there, deploy it, see what it does. So what I started doing for the solution that did actually work, and again, I didn't know if it was going to work yet, I started recording this video called The Weekly Motivation. First one I ever put out. I said that the people follow me on YouTube, I'm going to put this out once a week, and if y'all like it, I'll keep doing it. If you don't like it, then I'll stop doing it. And I put out a couple of them just to see how, after the first one, people said, yeah, keep doing it. And after I put out a couple more, I just wanted to test and gauge how the market was responding. And I asked my audience if they were interested in hearing this stuff, because again, I hadn't done this yet, and they said they wanted to hear it. So I decided I would try it every week. Again, I was going to try it out and see what happened. And that is how I began to use or share my solution. Now, for you, it might be putting out a product and seeing people buy it. Maybe it's offering a sample of what you do for free and seeing what kind of response you get. Maybe it's putting a price out and a product out there and seeing if anybody goes and buys it. And if so, then you go and create the product because you haven't even created it yet. Maybe it's trying a new method to get attention to see if it's working or not working. Whatever it is, this point is about to start trying the idea that you came up with to see what happens. And the good news is you can trial many different ideas all at the same time. And then you just pick whichever one is actually working. People in advertising do this all the time. In marketing, this is done all the time. So whatever it is, the point is about putting stuff out there, trying the idea, see what happens. And you can do this many times, often at the same time as your golden idea that you think is going to be the golden arrow that solves everything. It may not work. Again, so for me, luckily, this is just lucky, my first idea did work. So I didn't have to do a bunch of trial and error, because the first thing that I put out when it came to giving mindsets to athletes, they immediately took to it and I immediately kept it up. Moving on to point number 5. Today's topic, once again, is your why framework. And this is basically you explaining why you do what you do. Number 5 is the epiphany. This is when you realize that you've come across something that does work. So luckily for me, it happened on the first try, but there have been other things where I had to go through many tries. For example, when I was trying to become a professional basketball player, I went through a whole lot of trials before I got to a solution to which I didn't have to keep trying to do the same thing. When I was trying to get a basketball agent, I cold called 60 basketball agents. All right, so there was a whole lot of trials, and I only ended up signing with one agent. So 1 out of 60. You do the math on that. That was not an immediate ROI. I had to try a whole bunch of things before I came to the epiphany. Okay, finally this thing worked. So the epiphany is when, after all your trial and error, if there was any, you realize that you have a solution that actually is a good one and is a useful one, is one that you can do at least over and over again, or at least enough to get the results that you want. My epiphany was that basketball players actually really wanted and valued learning about the mental side of the game. And they realized that the stuff I was sharing with them could also be used off the court and outside of the sports realm, which is why some of you who are listening to the show to this very day originally found me through basketball material, but also realized that the stuff that I was talking about could apply off the court in other aspects of life. And many of you maybe are not playing basketball anymore the way that you were then, but you can still be attached to the message because there's still value in it for you. So that was one epiphany. I actually got two epiphanies out of this because the other one was that, and this is more important, was that people who were not athletes were hearing my messages and they were realizing that this stuff could apply to them even though they didn't even play sports. And this is important because remember who I'm talking to. I was talking to an audience of salespeople when I was explaining this. So they don't care about being a basketball player. So this is the part that I more emphasized and took more time on, is that I realized that people like you all, again, talking to these salespeople I was training, value this mindset piece, and you like the fact that it was coming from someone who comes from a different world, like the sports world. And this is a big deal because I had always been thinking about how can I transition out of being a sports guy and talk to people who are not sports fans. And I needed a reason to be relevant to these people. Well, this was it. This was the bridge. The bridge between my background as an athlete and the people who I talk to today, many of you who are not athletes, is that the stuff that athletes need mentally to be successful is the same stuff that people like you need, entrepreneurs and professionals need to be successful. That's the bridge. Same stuff that works in sports works in business. That was my bridge. And that was the epiphany, was me realizing that, oh, this mindset stuff that athletes need is the same mindset stuff that a salesperson needs. Moving on to point number 6. Today's topic, once again, is your why framework. Number 6. Now I'm here and things are good. Again, that's part of your story. Now I'm here and things are good. So this is after you found a solution, you tried a bunch of stuff, you found a solution, you got the epiphany, and now you have basically made it into a thing in this normal life now. This is the conclusion of the story, which should bring people to where you are today. So the conclusion is to say, well, now that I explained all that, now you know why I'm doing what I'm doing right now in front of you today. So it should tell people what you're doing today and where you are today. What I'm doing now is taking the skill, and you can add this piece in as well. What I realized was not necessarily that it was just the mindset piece that was so valuable to others. Yes, the mindset piece is really valuable and it's the foundation of what we do here at Work on Your Game. But I realized that my main money skill in all of this stuff that I'm talking about was my ability to break things down and then put them back together. That's my real money skill. Because when I was teaching basketball players through YouTube videos, they were valuing my message the same way that a salesperson or entrepreneur listening to me today values my message. But what was the difference? I wasn't talking about mindset back then with basketball players. What I was doing was taking something that people could see and that they knew they wanted to be better at, like mindset. You can't see your mindset, but you can feel it. You knew you want something that people wanted to be better at. And I was breaking it down and putting it back together in a way that anyone could understand, appreciate, and apply. That's what I did in basketball. That's what I do in mindset. That's what I do with business. That's what I do with all the other topics that you hear me talk about here. I realized that that was the real skill. It wasn't necessarily the subject of mindset, because a lot of people talk about mindset, but my ability to explain it and break it down was the real differentiator. So what I can also say is that one of my epiphanies was that my special power was that, not just mindset from a sports angle or dribbling the basketball. It was how I explain things. That was what separated me from anybody else who might be talking about a similar subject. So that brings us all to where we are today. All right, see how that works? So if you listen to this show, you know that I talk about mindset often, but not every episode. Sometimes I talk about business, sometimes leadership, sometimes it's a communication subject, sometimes it's current event, but they all use the same skill of breaking down a topic into easy to understand material. That's my MO. That's another piece of my epiphany. Depending on how much time I have or how much time I want to take when explaining my background, I can go into depth on these things as I've done here, or I explain all this in, as I already told you, 30 seconds. So you want to be able to do the same so that you can explain yourself, you explain why you do things, what you do, and keep in mind that people buy from people whom they know, like, and trust. And you can get someone to feel like they know you by simply sharing your story so that they understand who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. Also giving yourself a possibility to connect with them on a deeper level because some of your story is shared by them. That's how they feel like they know you. Liking you is the fact that you can share something that allows them to connect with you in whatever way, even if they don't have personal experience. I say my background was in playing basketball, or maybe they're a big basketball fan. So that can make them like me just because we got that one thing in common. And then the trust factor is people just knowing who you are. What are you about? If you just go to people with your sales pitch and your offering, you might be able to sell depending on what you're selling. But also, depending on what you're selling, you need people to feel like they can trust you. You need people to feel like there is some type of human connection between you and them, and you need to feel like there's some type of human being behind the offering that's being made to them. Again, depending on what you're selling, this can matter more or less. So with all that said, let's recap today's class, which is your why framework, explaining why you do what you do. And again, this is something that I realized that I was using when some salespeople asked me, Dre, can you explain the framework behind you sharing your personal background? Didn't even realize that I was using one, but now, since I did, I went and made content out of it. You all who are content creators should be taking note of that part just right there. Number one is I was doing X. This is just the start of your situation. Number two, got presented with a problem or challenge. So again, Will Smith, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, West Philadelphia, born and raised. That's point number one. Number two, a couple of guys acting up to no good, started making trouble in my neighborhood. All right, that's the presented with a problem or challenge. Number three, trial and error for solutions. His trial and error, Will Smith's, was I got in one little fight. My mom got scared. She says, moving with your cousins and auntie and uncle in Bel-Air, right? That was the trial and error. She got in the fight. Mom got scared, and she says, you got to get out of here. You got to go somewhere else. All right, this is the part of the story where you explain what you did to try to solve the situation. Number four is that you used or shared your solution. So what Will Smith said, I was a Ford cab, and when he came there, the license plate said Fresh, and there were dice in the mirror. So he got in the cab, and he took a cab from Philadelphia to Bel-Air. That's a long cab ride. But anyway, this is where you take it a bit further. You see if your solution actually works. Number five is the epiphany. You realize that it worked. And he says, no, if anything, I said, this cab is wherever I thought, man, forget it. Your home's the Bel-Air. All right, so then there's a little music. I pulled up to the house about 7 or 8, and I yelled to the cabbie, your home, smell you later. All right, so that's the epiphany. He got there. Actually, is this part, is he realized that it worked. He said, looked at my kingdom. I was finally there to sit on my throne as the Prince of Bel-Air. He realized that it worked. That's the end game. That's when he said, okay, that's the epiphany. This worked. I'm in Bel-Air. And then number 6, now I'm here and things are good. All right, so when the song is going off and you see Will Smith knocking on the door and the door's about to open, he's going to go live with his auntie and uncle in Bel-Air. That's when it's now I'm here, things are good. And usually the next thing you see is the TV show actually beginning and Will Smith doing whatever Will Smith is doing on the show. This is the conclusion of the story as I made it to Bel-Air. Everybody get it? So you need to look at your favorite movies, look at your own background even better, and start figuring out what is your why framework of how you got from where you were to where you are. And if you ever get lost, just think about the song from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air where he gives you that whole thing in like 60 seconds. All right, you need to be able to do the same in 60 seconds or 60 minutes. All that said, make sure you check my text number down below in the description. So if you're not part of my community, you get that text once we start sending it again and reactivate. Also, workonyourgameuniversity.com. If you want to build a business and a brand around yourself, your story, your background, come to the university, have me as your direct coach, and let's get to work sooner rather than later. That's workonyourgameuniversity.com. Work on your game. Dre, all